Naomi Blake had spent years mastering the art of patience, of knowing when to push and when to hold back, of understanding the silent rules that dictated who belonged and who did not. She had learned to read the way spaces shifted, the way people reacted when she entered a room, the way gazes flickered over her before moving on as if she were an afterthought. But patience had its limits, and tonight, sitting in Stanton's Prime, she felt something inside her harden. The restaurant was a shrine to exclusivity, with its soft golden lighting, crystal chandeliers casting their glow over pristine white tablecloths, and a hum of quiet, measured conversations between the city's elite. Everything was curated to perfection, from the hand-polished silverware to the seamless choreography of waiters gliding between tables, yet Naomi knew better than to be fooled by its elegance. She had been here before, not in this exact seat, but in 100 different places like it, where the walls whispered the same message: "You do not belong." She sat near the back, close enough to the kitchen that the smell of seared steak and garlic-infused butter clung to the air. Her reservation, confirmed days in advance, had promised a table by the window, a view of the city skyline stretching into the night, yet when she arrived, a forced apology and a tight-lipped smile informed her of the sudden change. It wasn't a mistake. It never was. She had watched as a well-dressed white couple, who arrived after her without a reservation, was led to the very spot she had requested. She had watched the subtle shift in the waiter's demeanor when addressing her compared to the effortless charm afforded to other patrons. And she had watched the manager's approach, his expression calm but purposeful, his hands clasped in front of him as though rehearsing a script. His words were measured, carefully polished to sound neutral, but Naomi knew better. She had heard them before. A minor inconvenience. An unfortunate situation. A necessary adjustment for the good of the establishment. He spoke with a practiced ease, one that came from experience, from knowing most people wouldn't make a scene, from knowing that the discomfort he caused was just subtle enough to be brushed aside. Naomi's fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, her nails tapping against the thin glass with a soft, deliberate rhythm. She could have let it go. She could have sighed, swallowed the familiar bitterness, and accepted the alternative seating arrangement they had so graciously offered. But she was tired. Tired of shrinking herself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. Tired of allowing people like him to pretend their decisions were impartial. So instead, she reached for her phone, the cool weight of it grounding her as she dialed a number she rarely used but had memorized nonetheless. The manager's expression barely flickered at first, but she saw the moment the recognition hit him, the moment his mask slipped, the way his mouth tightened just slightly. She didn't need to speak loudly. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention. The act itself was enough. A direct line to the owner of the very restaurant that had deemed her unworthy of a proper seat. She kept her voice low, controlled, her words precise as she detailed the situation in a tone so calm it left no room for argument. She let her gaze linger on the manager as she spoke, watching as the confidence drained from his face with each passing second. He had assumed she would do what so many before her had done, grit her teeth, leave without protest, tell herself it wasn't worth the fight. He had counted on her silence. Instead, she ended the call, set her phone down, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Across from her, the manager hesitated, his composure unraveling, the reality of his mistake settling into his bones. She didn't need to say anything more. The balance of power had shifted, and for once, it was in her hands. The call had been made, and the moment it hit the right ears, a ripple effect began, spreading far beyond the confines of Stanton's Prime. Naomi Blake had seen discrimination before, had felt its quiet weight press against her in rooms where she was meant to feel small, but this was different. This wasn't an unspoken slight, a glance that lasted too long, or an assumption wrapped in polite words. This was systemic, intentional, woven into the very foundation of a business that thrived on the illusion of exclusivity. The name Richard Stanton was not just attached to a restaurant. It was a brand, a legacy built on carefully cultivated relationships with high-powered investors, politicians, and the kind of people who dictated who was allowed at the table and who was not. His network extended beyond the restaurant industry, dipping into real estate, media, and private equity, a web of influence so thick that few dared to challenge it. He didn't need to say out loud what his establishments were built on. His policies, his hiring practices, his unspoken rules ensured that a certain type of clientele always felt welcome while others were quietly pushed aside. Naomi's complaint didn't stay within the walls of the restaurant. It wasn't contained to hushed conversations among staff or a formal letter that would be conveniently ignored. She took it to the press, laying out exactly what had happened, detailing the patterns she suspected ran deeper than a single bad interaction, and the story caught fire. It wasn't just about one evening, one manager's decision, or one refusal to seat her properly. It was about the culture of exclusion that Stanton's Prime had perfected over years. The headlines painted Richard Stanton as the face of a growing scandal, and his response was as swift as it was calculated. He called it a misunderstanding, a regrettable incident blown out of proportion, a lapse in judgment by a manager who would be retrained to ensure every guest felt welcome. He appeared in interviews with a carefully rehearsed apology, speaking in smooth, polished tones about the restaurant's commitment to diversity while subtly dismissing Naomi's accusations as an isolated event. He played the role of the concerned businessman flawlessly, but Naomi wasn't fooled. Behind closed doors, she knew what was really happening: meetings with PR firms, lawyers drafting statements designed to deflect responsibility, private discussions with investors who were more concerned with maintaining the restaurant's prestige than addressing its ingrained discrimination. Inside Stanton's Prime, the atmosphere shifted. Waiters avoided eye contact, whispers filled the back rooms, and the usually confident managers moved with a nervous edge. Naomi reached out to employees, past and present, hoping to confirm what she already knew, that this wasn't new, that she wasn't the first. Most were too afraid to speak, their jobs too precarious, their paychecks too necessary to risk stepping forward. But some, in quiet corners and through anonymous messages, admitted the truth. They had seen it before. They had been told which guests to prioritize, which reservations to accidentally lose, which tables to reserve for the right kind of clientele. They had watched customers like Naomi be subtly guided toward lesser seating, their presence treated as an inconvenience rather than an expectation. And now, the man responsible for it all had come to face her himself. Richard Stanton arrived with the air of someone who was used to control, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, his handshake firm but brief. He did not waste time with pretense. He spoke in measured tones, his words carrying the weight of a man who had silenced far greater problems with a checkbook and a well-placed favor. He did not deny what had happened but framed it as an unfortunate incident that could be rectified. He talked of resolutions, of misunderstandings, of the power of moving forward rather than dwelling on unnecessary conflict. He suggested that perhaps Naomi would prefer a private settlement, something to compensate for her unpleasant experience. It was not an offer, it was a challenge, a test of how far she was willing to go. Naomi did not flinch. She met his gaze, letting the silence stretch between them, letting him see that she was not someone who could be bought. She did not need money. She did not need his carefully crafted apology. She needed the truth, and she needed justice. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but unyielding. No settlement. No quiet resolution. No erasing what had already begun. She was going to dig deeper. And this time, she wouldn't stop until the entire system he had built began to crack. Naomi did not wait for permission. She knew Richard Stanton's empire was built on more than just fine dining and exclusivity. It was built on carefully maintained silence, on unspoken rules that dictated who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. She started with former employees, tracking them down through quiet conversations, anonymous tips, and late-night phone calls that began hesitantly before unraveling into confessions. Most were afraid, their voices edged with the weight of knowing too much and the fear of what speaking out might cost them. Then she found Emily Torres, a former waitress who had lasted 6 months at Stanton's Prime before quitting in frustration. Emily had been there the night a well-dressed black couple was seated near the entrance instead of at the prime table they had reserved. When she questioned it, her manager had told her to move them, because a more suitable party had just arrived. The suitable party was a wealthy white couple, regulars whom Richard himself had dined with before. Emily had refused at first, had argued that the reservation had been booked weeks in advance, but she was told that certain expectations had to be met. She had watched the couple's faces fall as they were led to the less desirable table, had felt the shame burning under her skin as she obeyed orders. A week later, she handed in her resignation. Then there was Daniel Hughes, a supplier who had worked with Stanton's restaurants for years. He had seen things, heard things, but had always told himself it wasn't his business, until now. He spoke of whispered instructions, of staff trained to seek preferred clientele in the best sections while subtly steering others elsewhere. He described meetings where managers were told to maintain a specific atmosphere, to ensure the restaurant's high standards weren't diluted. The deeper Naomi dug, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a policy. A calculated, deliberate practice woven into the very fabric of Stanton's brand. Then the press got hold of it. A journalist published a scathing article detailing similar complaints across multiple Stanton-owned restaurants. Former employees came forward, emboldened by Naomi's refusal to back down, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and exclusion. The story spread fast, picking up momentum, turning into a wildfire that Richard could no longer contain. His empire, once untouchable, was beginning to crack. He had spent years ensuring that his business operated without scrutiny, but now, with every new revelation, control was slipping through his fingers. And when powerful men feel their grip weakening, they don't retreat. They strike. Naomi knew the backlash was coming before it even began. The moment the article exposing Stanton's discriminatory policies went viral, the moment employees started coming forward, the moment investors started whispering about the damage to the brand, she knew Richard Stanton wouldn't sit still. He had spent too many years building his empire, too many years ensuring that the right people stayed comfortable while the wrong people were pushed aside, too many years cultivating power that didn't take kindly to being challenged. The first strike came in the form of rumors, whispers in the darkest corners of the internet, vague accusations buried in comment sections and anonymous blogs, stories about Naomi's past resurfacing in ways designed to discredit her. They called her an opportunist, claimed she had a history of stirring up trouble for her own benefit, accused her of targeting Stanton not because of justice but because of personal ambition. They dug through old cases she had worked on, twisting facts, making it seem as if every step of her career had been calculated for attention rather than change. They painted her as vindictive, manipulative, hungry for power. Then came the calls, polite, measured, laced with the kind of threats that didn't sound like threats at all. People with influence, people with money, people who operated in spaces Naomi had spent her career fighting against. They spoke in carefully chosen words, suggesting that perhaps she had done enough, that she had made her point, that there was no need to escalate things further. They talked of consequences, of how quickly things could spiral, of how some battles were best left alone. They framed it as concern, as advice from those who understood the world better than she did, but Naomi recognized fear when she heard it. They weren't worried about her. They were worried about what she had started. Then the government came knocking. An audit, sudden and aggressive, a full-scale review of her firm's finances that had no clear origin but every indication of being orchestrated. Documents requested, bank statements examined, questions asked that had nothing to do with her business and everything to do with making her life difficult. It was a tactic as old as power itself. Bury your enemy in bureaucracy, exhaust them with paperwork, drown them in technicalities until they have no energy left to fight. But Naomi had fought harder battles than this. Then came the message. A man from Stanton's inner circle, someone with access, someone who had seen what Richard had worked so hard to keep buried. He had proof, real, undeniable proof of the policies, the internal memos, the quiet orders given behind closed doors. He had seen how Stanton manipulated seating charts, had watched managers receive instructions on how to make certain customers feel unwelcome without ever saying it outright. He had everything Naomi needed to take Stanton down for good. But before he could meet with her, before he could pass on the evidence that would seal Stanton's fate, he disappeared. His phone disconnected, his apartment empty, his name suddenly absent from every place he had once occupied. It was a message, a warning, and proof that Naomi was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The first message arrived at midnight, a single sentence typed in block letters with no sender attached. Walk away while you still can. Naomi stared at the screen, her fingers tightening around the phone, her heartbeat steady but her breath coming slower. The second came an hour later, this time with an image, a dark silhouette standing near the entrance of her office, time-stamped just minutes before. She locked her door, turned off the lights, and sat in the silence, knowing that fear was exactly what they wanted. But fear had never stopped her before. The calls began the next morning, distorted voices, robotic filters masking identities, low and deliberate warnings that promised consequences. They didn't say what those consequences would be, but they didn't have to. Naomi knew the language of intimidation, had seen it used against whistleblowers, journalists, activists who got too close to something powerful. They wanted her shaken. They wanted her to second-guess every move. They wanted her to believe she was alone. But she wasn't. Her best friend and closest colleague, David Wells, had been watching the whole thing unfold, had stood by her when the first article hit, had helped her sift through witness statements and financial records, had believed in this fight as much as she did. But now, for the first time, he hesitated. "You need to back off," he said, his voice low, his hands braced on her desk like he was trying to hold the room together. "Just for a little while. Let this cool down." But Naomi didn't believe in cooling down. She believed in momentum. She believed in pushing forward when the resistance was strongest, because that's when the truth was closest. And the truth had never felt closer than now. The financial director had agreed to meet her, one of Stanton's former executives, someone who had overseen budgets, processed payouts, signed off on expenses that had been carefully hidden from public scrutiny. He knew the numbers. He knew where the bodies were buried. If she could get his testimony, if she could confirm what she already suspected about off-the-books payments to managers who upheld Stanton's selective hospitality, she would have enough to bring the entire empire down. They met in a quiet cafe on the far edge of town, a place where no one knew her name, where the noise of clinking cups and murmured conversations made it harder for anyone to eavesdrop. But before they even sat down, she felt it, that weight of being watched, the flicker of movement just beyond the glass window, the way the same car had circled the block twice in the last 10 minutes. He noticed it too. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, his eyes scanning the room with the sharp paranoia of someone who had been in this game long enough to know when the rules had changed. "They know I'm here," he muttered, barely moving his lips, his fingers tightening around the sleeve of his drink. Naomi didn't turn around. She didn't react. She just nodded once, because acknowledging fear gave it power, and right now, she needed every ounce of control. They spoke quickly, carefully, but before he could pass anything to her, he stood abruptly, his face pale, his breath short. "I have to go," he said, his voice just above a whisper. And then he was gone. 2 hours later, Naomi's phone shut down, the screen flashing, glitching, restarting in a loop she couldn't break. Her email wouldn't open. Her passwords had been changed. Every file, every message, every conversation, gone. They weren't just watching. They were inside her world now. Naomi knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. The threats, the surveillance, the digital invasion into her life, none of it was random, none of it was impulsive. It was precise, calculated, designed to wear her down until she let go. But she wasn't going to let go. That's when Julian Marquez entered the fight. He had been watching from the sidelines, following the ripples her investigation had caused, and when the threats against her became impossible to ignore, he made his move. An independent journalist, relentless in his pursuit of exposing corruption, he had spent years peeling back the layers of power that men like Richard Stanton used as armor. He had seen the patterns before, knew how these systems worked, how scandals were buried, how witnesses were silenced. When Naomi agreed to meet him, she expected skepticism, doubt, a lecture on the dangers of going after someone as deeply entrenched as Stanton. Instead, she found understanding. He didn't waste time questioning if she was ready for what came next. He already knew she was. Together, they started digging deeper, searching for a trail Stanton might have overlooked, something more concrete than testimony, something that couldn't be dismissed as opinion or coincidence. That's when they found Greg Larson. He had been a senior accountant for Stanton's restaurant empire for 5 years before abruptly resigning, his departure swept under the rug with a vague press statement about pursuing new opportunities. But Naomi had seen his financial records, had traced his career movements, and she knew the truth: Greg hadn't left on his own terms. He had been pushed out. When they tracked him down, he was reluctant, guarded, unwilling to speak beyond vague acknowledgments that, yes, things at Stanton's weren't always ethical, that, yes, he had seen numbers that didn't add up, but he wasn't about to go on record. It took an hour of conversation, of Julian pressing, of Naomi making it clear that he wasn't the only one who had been wronged, before Greg finally leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "They delete reports," he said, rubbing a hand over his face as if he could wipe away the guilt that had been weighing on him for years. "They keep 2 sets of books. One for the investors, one for themselves. The real numbers never see the light of day." He described how expenses were manipulated, how payouts to managers who enforced Stanton's standards were carefully hidden under miscellaneous costs, how corporate memos with discriminatory seating instructions were routinely scrubbed from digital records after managers received them. He hadn't spoken about it before because he knew what Stanton was capable of, knew what happened to people who tried to expose him. But Naomi and Julian weren't leaving without proof. Greg handed over a flash drive, filled with internal financial documents, payroll anomalies, and encrypted emails that had been meant to disappear. It was more than enough to prove a pattern of systemic discrimination, of policies enforced at the highest level. But they needed more. They needed a voice from inside. That's when they found Michael Grant, a current manager at one of Stanton's flagship restaurants. Michael had seen it all firsthand: the guest lists, the coded language in scheduling meetings, the way certain patrons were treated as invisible. He agreed to meet them, nervous but willing, speaking in hushed tones as he described the training he had received, the unspoken but unmistakable directives on how to maintain Stanton's image. He had seen people turned away without reason, watched as reservations were rearranged to accommodate preferred clientele. He knew it was wrong. But fear was a powerful thing. Halfway through his statement, his phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, and Naomi saw the blood drain from his face. Without a word, he stood, shaking his head, his hands trembling as he backed away from the table. "I can't," he muttered, and then he was gone. Julian didn't hesitate. He had left his recorder running the entire time. The fear in Michael's voice, the weight of the confession he had barely begun to make, it was all there, preserved. They had what they needed. They had proof. They had a case. And they were taking it to the prosecutors. The article hit the press like a lightning strike, igniting a firestorm that Richard Stanton could no longer control. The headline was brutal, direct, and impossible to ignore. "Inside Stanton's Prime: How an Empire of Exclusivity Was Built on Discrimination." The piece was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, combining testimonies from former employees, financial records that revealed hush money payouts, and the leaked audio of a terrified manager admitting to the quiet policies that had governed Stanton's restaurants for years. Julian Marquez had outdone himself, crafting a narrative that was damning not just because of what it revealed, but because of the undeniable pattern it exposed. This wasn't one restaurant, one rogue manager, or one misunderstanding. This was a system, meticulously maintained, deliberately designed to exclude while pretending to welcome. Social media exploded within hours, hashtags trending, furious debates flooding every platform. People who had dined at Stanton's Prime, who had once felt an unnamed discomfort but couldn't place why, now saw their experiences validated. Customers who had been subtly steered toward lesser tables, who had been told that their reservations had been misplaced, who had left feeling like they didn't quite belong, began speaking up. The outrage was swift, relentless, and growing by the minute. The silence from Stanton's corporate office stretched just long enough for the damage to deepen before they released an official statement, vague, polished, dripping with carefully worded regret. They called the accusations concerning. They assured the public they would review internal policies. They promised swift action. But it was too late. Businesses tied to Stanton's name started backing away. High-profile investors made quiet calls, distancing themselves from any financial involvement. Luxury brands that had partnered with his restaurants began reconsidering endorsements. Hotels that had once listed Stanton's locations as premier dining experiences swiftly removed his name from their recommendations. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had just become the face of modern-day segregation in fine dining. Then came the new witnesses. Former hosts, servers, even longtime patrons who had turned a blind eye for years but could no longer ignore what was happening. They described how reservations were handled, how guests were filtered, how seating charts were subtly rearranged to maintain an image. Some even spoke of training sessions where managers were coached on language that would allow them to deny service without explicitly stating why. More recordings surfaced, more testimonies poured in, and the story snowballed into something even Stanton's most powerful allies couldn't suppress. Richard Stanton finally emerged from the shadows, stepping in front of cameras with the same arrogance that had protected him for decades. He sat for an exclusive interview, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture composed, his expression carefully curated to exude concern but not guilt. He dismissed the allegations as misinterpretations, blamed a few misguided employees, claimed that his restaurants had always been committed to diversity and inclusion. He spoke in platitudes, assured the public that he was deeply saddened by the accusations, but never once admitted fault. It was a performance, polished and strategic, but the public wasn't buying it. The calls for his resignation were immediate and deafening. Protesters gathered outside his flagship locations, signs raised, chants growing louder. Political figures, eager to align themselves with public sentiment, began demanding accountability. News anchors dissected his every word, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies in his statements. No one believed him. No one was willing to let this story fade. Then came the final blow. The government investigation. State agencies announced an official probe into Stanton's business practices, citing credible allegations of discriminatory conduct and financial mismanagement. Subpoenas were issued, corporate files requested, key figures called in for questioning. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was now under siege, and for the first time in his life, Richard Stanton was losing control. Naomi had known from the beginning that this fight wouldn't end in the streets or on the front pages of newspapers. It had to be won in court, where facts carried more weight than outrage and where men like Richard Stanton could no longer hide behind polished statements and empty apologies. She filed the lawsuit against Stanton's Prime with the full force of the evidence she had gathered, charging the company with systemic discrimination, civil rights violations, and fraudulent business practices designed to conceal its exclusionary policies. The moment the legal documents became public, the case became more than just hers. It became a landmark. Lawyers from advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and even former federal prosecutors reached out, offering their support, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about a restaurant. This was about a precedent. Richard Stanton, for all his arrogance, was not a fool. He knew the stakes. He knew that if this case went to trial, everything he had built could come crumbling down. He had spent decades using money as a shield, ensuring that no legal battle ever made it far enough to threaten him. He had judges on his call list, attorneys who owed him favors, and politicians who had dined at his tables while shaking his hand in backroom deals. He moved quickly, arranging discreet meetings, offering settlements, making promises to people in power that if they helped him now, they would be well compensated later. But he had miscalculated. The media attention was suffocating, the kind of relentless scrutiny that made it impossible for anyone to quietly dismiss the case without facing public backlash. Every motion, every delay tactic, every attempt to suppress evidence was met with immediate headlines, and no judge wanted their name attached to what was rapidly becoming one of the most high-profile discrimination lawsuits in recent history. The case moved forward, and Richard Stanton, for the first time in his life, was forced to sit in a courtroom and answer for what he had done. The testimonies were devastating. Former employees, emboldened by the public support, took the stand, describing in detail how they had been instructed to manipulate reservations, how they had watched black customers be turned away under false pretenses, how they had been reprimanded for seating the wrong kind of guests in high-profile areas. Financial records proved how bonuses had been issued to managers who upheld Stanton's discriminatory policies, showing a direct incentive structure that rewarded exclusion. Internal emails revealed coded language, instructions from corporate to maintain the ambience of the restaurant at all costs. Richard Stanton sat stone-faced as his empire was dissected before him, as the careful veneer of respectability he had crafted was torn apart, piece by piece, in front of a judge who had no choice but to acknowledge the weight of the evidence. Public pressure mounted. Investigators uncovered more than just discrimination. There were financial discrepancies, unreported cash payments, potential fraud that extended beyond seating policies and into criminal misconduct. The walls around Stanton were closing in, and for the first time, there was no escape. His power, his influence, his carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. The collapse of Stanton's empire did not come suddenly, nor did it come with a single, dramatic blow. It was slow, relentless, and inevitable, like a building set ablaze from within, crumbling piece by piece as the fire consumed its foundation. The first fractures appeared when the key investors, the ones who had stood by him for years, who had quietly profited from his business while ignoring the whispers of discrimination, began pulling out. They didn't make loud announcements or public statements. They simply disappeared, liquidating their shares, distancing themselves from the toxicity that now surrounded his name. Stanton had always operated with the illusion of invulnerability, but without money, without protection, without the silent backing of the wealthy elite who had shielded him for so long, he was nothing. The financial losses were staggering. Stanton's prime had been synonymous with high society, a place where power met indulgence, where business deals were struck over glasses of aged whiskey and meticulously plated dishes. But the scandal poisoned the brand. Protests outside his restaurants grew larger, customers canceled reservations en masse, and even the most loyal patrons, those who had once been part of the exclusive club that Stanton had so carefully cultivated, decided that being associated with him was simply bad for their own image. Within weeks, foot traffic dropped to historic lows. Then locations began closing, one after another. The flagship restaurant in Manhattan was the first to go, followed by two in Los Angeles, then another in Chicago. Each closure was a public spectacle, covered by every major news outlet, a visible reminder that no amount of wealth could protect a man who had been exposed. Desperate and flailing, Stanton did what men like him always did. He cast himself as the victim. He gave interviews claiming that this was a witch hunt, a targeted attack by those who envied his success, an orchestrated smear campaign led by radical activists who wanted to destroy a self-made businessman. He pointed directly at Naomi, accusing her of fueling cancel culture, of manipulating the media, of ruining lives in her pursuit of personal vengeance. But his words no longer carried weight. The public had already made up its mind. His credibility was shattered, his legacy stained beyond repair. The once revered entrepreneur had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system he had thrived in, and no carefully worded statement or legal maneuver could undo that. Then the final verdict arrived. The court ruled that Stanton's prime had engaged in systemic racial discrimination, that the company had deliberately violated civil rights laws, that its policies had actively worked to exclude black patrons under the guise of maintaining ambience. The ruling was unprecedented not just because of the scope of the case, but because of what it represented, a rare moment of accountability for a man who had spent his life believing he was untouchable. And yet, Stanton's problems did not end there. As financial documents were examined, as former executives came forward, as years of buried transactions were unearthed, new evidence surfaced, proof of tax evasion, money laundering, and fraudulent business practices that went far beyond discriminatory seating policies. The government launched a criminal investigation, subpoenas were issued, and suddenly, Stanton wasn't just fighting to salvage his reputation. He was fighting to stay out of prison. But Richard Stanton had never been the kind of man to face consequences willingly. One morning, before charges could be formally filed, before he could be forced into a courtroom in handcuffs, he was gone. A private jet, an international bank account, a discreet departure to a country with no extradition agreement. His final, desperate attempt to escape the wreckage of his own making. But exile was not victory. His fortune was bleeding out, his name was a stain on the industry, his network of influence had turned its back on him. He was no longer feared. He was no longer respected. He was nothing. And Naomi, standing in the city that had once belonged to him, watched as the empire he had built from exclusion and privilege collapsed into dust. Naomi Blake had won, but she knew this was not the kind of victory that ended with celebration. Richard Stanton was gone, his empire reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, his name spoken only in whispers of disgrace, but the system that had allowed him to thrive still stood. The headlines would fade, the protests would quiet, and the world would move on, but discrimination, silent, insidious, and deeply rooted, would remain. One lawsuit, one scandal, one fallen man did not erase the generations of exclusion baked into the very fabric of society. She had exposed one villain, but there were others. There would always be others. And as she sat in her office, sifting through emails from people who had shared their own experiences, their own versions of Stanton's prime, she realized her work was only beginning. Then came the offer. A call from a name she recognized but had never spoken to directly, Monica Hayes, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling systemic inequality one battle at a time. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She got straight to the point. "We need you," she said. "We're starting something bigger. A legal defense fund for those who can't fight on their own. You've proven you don't back down. We need that." Naomi listened, felt the weight of it, the responsibility, the promise of more battles, more sleepless nights, more enemies who would see her as a threat. But she also felt something else. Purpose. A new war to wage. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The fallout from the Stanton case rippled far beyond what she had expected. Former employees of Stanton's prime, those who had once been too afraid to speak, reached out, not just to thank her, but to tell her how the culture had already begun to change. With Stanton gone, the restaurant had been acquired by new ownership, and with the toxicity stripped away, something remarkable had happened. Employees who had once been forced to enforce exclusion now had a say in how things were run. The silent policies were gone. The hierarchy of preferred clientele had crumbled. And for the first time in years, the restaurant was beginning to resemble what it should have been all along: a place for everyone. Some of the customers who had once turned away in frustration had returned, cautiously at first, waiting to see if the change was real. And it was. Naomi had never set out to fix Stanton's prime, but the fact that it had transformed in the wake of everything proved that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people refused to stay silent. The messages poured in. Strangers thanking her for speaking up. Activists using her case as fuel for their own fights. Young women asking how to do what she had done. She had never set out to be a symbol, but somehow, she had become one. She had exposed a system built on quiet exclusion, and in doing so, she had given others permission to challenge what they had once been told to accept. She stood outside the new offices of the legal fund, the city alive around her, the weight of the future pressing against her back. She had taken down one man, but there were more battles to fight, more voices to amplify, more doors to break open. She tightened her coat against the wind, exhaled slowly, and took the first step forward. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But justice, no matter how hard won, was always worth the battle. And she was just getting started.